Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and we're joined tonight by Ellen Hofer, the Director of EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland. She'll be coming in by Skype and there she is. So good evening, Ellen. How are you today?
Evening. Nice to see you. I'm good.
Excellent. Well, our first story tonight is former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has criticised as shameful the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision not to publish a parliamentary report on Russian meddling in UK politics until after next month's general election. The report by Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee has been cleared by the security services, but it has not yet been given approval for publication by Johnson's government, so will not appear before the vote on December 12th. I find it inexplicable that your government will not release a government report about Russian influence. Inexplicable and shameful, Clinton told the BBC in remarks reported today. There is no doubt, we know it in our country, we have seen it in Europe, we have seen it here, that Russia in particular is determined to try to shape the politics of Western democracies, Clinton said. On BBC Radio 4's Today programme, Clinton warned that she was dumbfounded by the UK government's decision not to publish the report, and that every person who votes in this country deserves to see that report before your election happens. Britain has accused Russia of meddling in the domestic politics and elections of several Western countries, including the US presidential election in which Clinton lost in the Electoral College to Donald Trump. The British government says it has not seen evidence of successful Russian interference in UK elections, including in the 2016 vote to leave the EU. Moscow has repeatedly denied any meddling and says the West is gripped by anti-Russian hysteria. US intelligence agencies say Russia sought to influence the 2016 presidential election through hacking and spreading propaganda aimed at helping Donald Trump defeat Clinton. The Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee's report contains allegations of Russia's attempts to interfere in Western politics and includes evidence from the main intelligence agencies MI5, GCHQ and MI6. The report was completed in March and then went through redaction by the Cabinet Office and Security Services, a process completed by early October, according to Dominic Grieve, who chaired the committee. Grieve, who was expelled from the parliamentary group for defying Boris Johnson over Brexit, said the report was sent to the Prime Minister on October 17th for final approval, a process he said normally takes just 10 days. Johnson's government says the delay is a result of normal procedures. There is a proper process that these reports go through. The ISC are aware of that, Johnson's spokesman said yesterday. That process hadn't completed by the time that Parliament was dissolved. As the report is supposed to be presented to Parliament, which is not sitting during the election campaign, the publication could be delayed by months. The Labour Party has said the decision not to release the report is an attempt to withhold the truth from the public and has said that both Johnson and his most senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, have links to Russia. The government has denied suggestions by the Labour Party that either the Conservatives or the government are linked to Russian disinformation campaigns. Meanwhile, the SNP has ramped up pressure on Boris Johnson to publish the report. It's been reported that 9 Russian business people who have donated cash to the Tory party are included in the documents. And Stuart MacDonald, the SNP's defence spokesperson and current candidate for Glasgow South constituency, said the longer Boris Johnson suppresses the security report on Russian interference, the more questions are raised about what the Tories are hiding. With former US presidential candidate Hillary Clinton warning that the Tories' refusal to release the report was inexplicable and shameful, Johnson can no longer ignore the mounting international concern. So, Ellen, what do you make of this intervention in foreign politics by Hillary Clinton?
I don't know. It seems like everybody has a right to comment on the democratic nature of somebody withholding a report that is pertinent to the majority of voters in a particular country. I don't think you have to be a national of any country, otherwise I should not be allowed to get involved in Scottish politics or have an opinion. And I think that's not how migration works. That's not how globalization works. If we know what's going on in another country, we should have the ability to speak out about what is or isn't going on in that country as well. And we should take responsibility where we are at locally.
And what's your feeling about this story generally? I mean, do you think this is just Boris Johnson trying to avoid anything that might be embarrassing coming out right before the election, or do you worry that there is something deeper, where there is some deep Russian influence within the Tory party?
I think the reality is that we will never know if we don't see the report. It is always suspicious when somebody handles the timing of how something comes out. I understand that there's a kitten alert. I understand that there's a proper process to these things. Just the suggestion that the Tories are currently typing quite a lot of releases, papers, and reports around their general election campaign, how late they're going to release their own manifesto, kind of points very clearly in the direction of manipulating where you want people to have information, and at which points it doesn't matter as much because you're not going to get elected for it.
Mm-hmm. And we've heard allegations of Russian interference in, as we mentioned a minute ago, in the Brexit referendum. There was talk about it even during as far back as the independence referendum. There's been this ongoing saga of Russian interference in American politics. Do you worry that is a real problem, or do you think we should probably just focus more on the corruption that we can actually identify in our own country before we start worrying too much about what's happening coming from Russia?
I think this shouldn't be an either-or question. This should be an and situation. We can both look abroad and look at our own affairs and understand what is and isn't corruption. Quite often, because especially in a globalized world, these things are interconnected. They are linked with one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, in a potentially linked story, the Labour Party today said it was subject to 2 significant cyber attacks on its digital platforms over the last 24 hours, but said it was confident that no data breach had occurred. British security services have warned that Russia and other countries could use cyber attacks or divisive political messages on social media to attempt to disrupt the general election. We have experienced a sophisticated and large-scale cyber attack on Labour digital platforms, a party spokesman said in a statement this morning. We took swift action and these attempts failed due to our robust security systems. The integrity of all our platforms was maintained and we are confident that no data breach occurred. A security official with knowledge of the matter claimed that the attack was a short-lived and relatively unsophisticated attempt to take down some of the party's websites by flooding them with malicious traffic. It was really very everyday, nothing more than what you would expect to see on a regular basis, the official said. It looked like someone bored in their bedroom with a botnet. The Labour spokesman said the party had reported the incident to the National Cyber Security Centre and that while the attack had slowed down some of their campaign activities, they had been restored earlier today. Britain's National Cyber Security Centre, part of the GCHQ Signals Intelligence Agency, said the first attack was a distributed denial of service attack, a common tactic where hackers try to crash websites by flooding and overwhelming them with enormous levels of traffic. DDoS attacks are a common form of attack used by a very wide range of attackers. Mitigation techniques are available and worked in this case, said an NCSC spokesman, adding that the nature of such attacks often made it difficult to quickly attribute responsibility. Later, a second attack followed a similar pattern, though it's unclear whether this was by the same entity or was perhaps a copycat attack. And Ellen, what do you make of this, that this Labour being attacked by somebody? Certainly there's a possibility again that this... Oh, and we do appear to have lost Ellen for a minute. Oh no, we're back. So, excellent. You still hear us, Ellen?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Repeat the question for me.
I will do. So again, this attack on the Labour Party, as we heard there, it could, in theory, be just random people trolling, or it could be, the Russian government making an attack on the Labour Party on behalf of the Tory Party. At this stage, we don't know, and we may never know. What do we make of this kind of thing happening more and more in politics across the world?
I think you're absolutely right. This is happening more and more, and not just across the world. Quite specifically in the UK, people are clocking on to the value of data, digital data. The Home Office website also seems to have some cookies that seem to track movements of the visitors that land there. There's an article about that not too far in the past, maybe a month or two ago. There is value in data, and as long as there's no proper legislation around it, it's very hard to estimate our politics. I think the problem is that this is happening in the shadows.
Sorry, Alan, can I just check? Do you have your phone buzzing beside you? Okay, we're getting some sort of noise on the line. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but okay. Anyway, we will get to discussing some other data issues a little bit later in the show, but as we continue on, just thinking about the election for now. Nicola Sturgeon today demanded the UK government take real and determined action to tackle child poverty by setting a legal target for ending child poverty and introducing new payments specifically to help children living in poverty. Latest DWP figures show that 30% of children across the UK are in poverty after housing costs, a damning condemnation of the Tory government. On the same measure, while child poverty in Scotland has risen since the start of Tory austerity-driven welfare cuts, including the benefit freeze and the two-child cap, it is lower in Scotland at 24% as a result of Scottish Government actions to mitigate the impact of a Tory government. SNP MPs are set to demand a package of action on child poverty, including the introduction of a new benefit that will reduce child poverty, learning from the groundbreaking Scottish Child Payment that has been described as game-changing by anti-poverty campaigners, re-establishing UK-wide legal targets for ending child poverty, which were abolished by the Tories, and establishing a Poverty and Inequality Commission to provide expert advice on using Westminster powers to tackle poverty and to report on progress. So what do you make of this, Ellen? I mean, obviously the Tories have made some quite savage cuts to the welfare state, and the SNP has kind of tried to pick up the mantle of some of that with their mitigation efforts. What do you make of this call? Do we expect to see a future Tory government follow this advice and suddenly become the pro-poor party of Britain?
That seems very unlikely. From the most stark figure that I remember from the last week is that homelessness among children has gone up by 73% under the Tory government. That is a pretty significant number, and even more egregious if you consider that just in the summer we had a big outrage because we found out that the Home Office and the British government had not used the funds provided in relation to child poverty by the EU to the UK at all. They hadn't touched that fund, but nonetheless allowed 73% rise in the number of children that had become homeless in the duration.
Mm-hmm. And the SNP government in Scotland obviously has taken some fairly significant efforts, including this new child payment, mitigation of the bedroom tax, all these efforts that have been made. But are they ever going to be enough, do you think?
I mean, we really can't say if they will ever be enough, and we might never find out if we don't go independent from where we have to consider this issue. You will never know. There are other independent countries where the figures are better, and there's independent countries where they aren't, so it depends very much on policy. I think what we need to remember is that the Scottish Government is mitigating. One of the interesting findings around these results for Scotland, that our child poverty rate is still not fantastic. Any child poverty rate will never be good, but it's lesser than the rest of the UK, is that the Scottish Government invested quite heavily in housing, and that the difference in cost in housing in Scotland makes a huge difference to people's levels of poverty. And that is something where it's pretty easy to understand why it would make such a huge difference. Other than that, if we don't have the full control over services and over pensions, over those areas that aren't currently devolved, that have to do with social life and social services, then we have no opportunity to ever find out whether Scotland would do better. The reality is that it can be done way better than the UK is doing.
Yeah, I mean there are many choices available to a government that has power over every issue that's it's much more difficult. I mean, until very recently, of course, the Scottish Government had no control over social security and has taken quite significant steps in the last year or two to really open that conversation up about how a welfare state could work in an independent Scotland. But as you say, without powers over taxation and all these other issues, it becomes much more difficult to achieve very much. In the polls this week, poll out today from Survation shows a slight a slight decline in the lead that the Tories hold over Labour. Support for the Conservatives rose by 1 point to 35%, while the Labour Party rose 3 points to 29%. The Liberal Democrats and the Brexit Party each fell 2 points to 17% and 10% respectively. And the SNP are at 4%, which obviously, this is a UK-wide poll. That doesn't tell us a huge amount about the real detail in Scotland. But what do you make of this, Ellen? We have seen for the last 3 years what we've consistently described, and most people have consistently described as amongst the worst, most chaotic, most, just messy Conservative governments we've ever seen, and yet they still hold this fairly significant lead over Labour. Why is it that Labour can't catch the Tories right now, or rather over the last 3 years? Why have they not been able to close that gap and overtake the Tories in the polls?
There's this old saying about something being, a choice between pest and cholera. And I think in the UK it's very much come to that point. It's two very bad options. And Labour specifically struggles from an identity crisis. Not least with this new, more recently still declared new leader of Jeremy Corbyn, who cannot make up his mind and quite often seems to be making policy decisions that go against the main body of the membership of Labour. It's a very interesting dynamic to see play out with almost anything to do with Brexit. The dynamic that we see play out would be much better helmed in a TV series than in real life, with real people's lives attached to it.
Yeah, I mean, what we have seen is that in the 2017 election, and perhaps what we're seeing with this poll, with the gap closing slightly, is that Jeremy Corbyn does seem to do better in a campaign environment, in a live election campaign. They believe that partly it's to do with the kind of different rules on media coverage, where there has to be a greater balance put into the media. But also, it does seem that Jeremy Corbyn just enjoys being out on the campaign trail, giving speeches, riling up crowds. Do you think that's something where he can turn this around? I mean, in this poll, it's only a 6-point gap. Could the Labour Party, do you think, turn this around and somehow come out ahead of the Tories?
I don't think there's time to do that for the general election. I'd be too happy to eat my words regarding that, though. I'd be mainly happy for the rest of the United Kingdom, because I can see that at least the manifestos and policies that Labour are recently starting to field are actually solid left policies that are progressive and would have quite significant positive impact on the UK economy, and those that require support the most. It would go quite some way towards evening the scales, but without a firm stance on Brexit, and quite frankly the realisation that no matter whose side you're on, whether it is Leave or Remain, all voters are basically fed up with Brexit and are not looking forward to a lengthy discussion to then go back to Europe to pretend to renegotiate a plan that has already been renegotiated and then reformulated for Boris Johnson so he can feed it to the Parliament again. It's just not a feasible strategy. I think it would have been much more feasible to call for a people's vote straight away and go from there. But a people's vote campaign, again, has also struggled in and of itself with contradictions. If we didn't like that the vote that took place about Brexit in the first place disenfranchised quite a lot of people, then this time around the People's Vote would have to campaign for 16 and 17-year-olds to be included, as well as EU nationals. That's a whole different can of worms that hasn't been opened, and really on a UK-wide stage really needs to be opened. It's about time.
Yeah, on that front, I mean, the issues around EU citizens, we will get to those a little bit later. But how does it feel as a new Scot to know that this election, which may have a very significant effect on your life personally, that you don't have a say in it?
Well, it's not like you grow used to it just because it's been the third time in 3 years that other people around me all had the opportunity to express themselves democratically, but I didn't. I feel pretty bitter about it. Not that it's an easy choice to make. I don't envy any of you, but I'd rather be part of that pool than part of the disenfranchised pool. I'm sure we all can agree in Scotland that citizens' rights and voting rights are something that are to be extended, not removed, and it's about time to have that discussion on a UK-wide level. Whether that discussion takes place with or without Scotland is in Scotland's hands, though.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, of course, we did see in Westminster when the discussion over when this election was going to happen, those amendments were brought up to allow EU citizens to vote, to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, and they were pretty swiftly dismissed. So it does seem like a much longer fight, certainly at Westminster, to try and get those issues on the table. But as you say, we should be expanding voting rights as far as possible. It doesn't make sense for you to be working here, living here, contributing to society here, and yet not able to vote. So yeah, we're on your side on that one. Just finally, sorry, go on.
But the way that we need to speak about those sort of things, we need to understand that huge democratic changes require significant public discussion with proper reasoned arguments. I felt pretty bitter about the amendment being brought up just the other week. I thought that a timeline of less than 7 weeks to make this constitutional change without a proper debate publicly or in Parliament really happen like that, and then still expect people to sign up, both 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds and EU citizens, it was an incredibly cynical move. So I don't approve of that kind of thing. If we're talking about citizens' rights, if we're talking about democratic rights, don't make it a political talking point, a throwaway point. I don't think that this advanced anybody's agenda, really. It's not a good look for anybody. It wasn't durable, and therefore should have been either fielded in a more sensitive way and in a different forum, or not brought up at all in that context.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Just finally on election news, the SNP has said that the Tories are running scared of their appalling record on the economy after Chancellor Sajid Javid refused to take part in this weekend's Channel 4 TV election debates. Ian Blackford has agreed to take part in the four-way economy debate on behalf of the SNP this Sunday, alongside John McDonnell for Labour, Ed Davey for the Lib Dems and Sajid Javid for the Tories. But the Chancellor then ducked out, leading to SNP calls for Channel 4 to empty chair the Tories. Ian Blackford said today, the Tories are running scared of their appalling record in government and the devastating harm they have caused communities across Scotland and the UK with their deep austerity cuts and extreme Brexit plans. It's frankly embarrassing that the Tory Chancellor is doing a chicken run and refusing to defend his party's record. Channel 4 should empty chair the Tories if they fail to turn up. The debate must go ahead. It would be a huge disservice to voters if broadcasters allowed the Tories to shut down debate and rig media coverage of the election in their favour. So, Ellen, what do you make of these TV debates generally? Are you a fan?
Well, I personally don't. I don't think it's relevant to my decision making. I mean, I don't watch them outside of the realm of what I have to watch anyway. I think it's important that if we talk about these discussions and platforms, then realistically we need to include all the parties running. There's obviously an issue with the timestamp coverage and who gets to speak for how long and what the percentages are. That there's candidates being offered a a place in such debates that have they have hardly any bearing on the UK-wide politics, and who are not, represented in Parliament like other parties who don't get that opportunity. That kind of thing has to end. But generally, we should all be looking at the policies of parties and not at the TB debates that last for an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and leave us all none the wiser if we don't check the facts that are being offered by the politicians representing their parties.
I mean, do you have any idea then of how you would prefer the media to approach these things? I mean, is there a way that you could see the party leaders, or like in this case the finance chiefs of the parties, taking on each other and actually jousting over those issues in a way that would be more effective than what we see from these kinds of debates?
I'd like to see some proper journalism back. Let's sit down, each of them, and ask proper journalistic questions based on the track record of each of these parties. Look at the facts, look at the policies that are out there, check the facts behind them. I think that is the better way to go about it. Otherwise, we'll always be dealing with the power stance sort of idea of how these debates have to go.
Yeah, I think checking facts is possibly going a little bit far for certain aspects of certain people within our media. But yeah, it is a strange sight seeing these leaders lined up, basically just giving 1 or 2 minute sound bites for an hour or two, and then there is, as you say, there is very little analysis done of what was true, what wasn't, what's actually, what the reality is of some of these sound bites that we hear. It's an interesting campaign. This whole election campaign is one of the more interesting ones I've ever seen in my life. So we will keep up to date with that. But we do have a few other stories to cover. So in Wales, for many years, Welsh independence was never seen as a particularly serious proposition. Even Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, used to treat it as more of a long-term goal than a realistic immediate goal. But the Brexit vote in 2016, which has been described by many as an English nationalist vote, has stirred up sentiment in Wales as well as in Scotland. Plaid elected a new leader last year, Adam Price, who is much more committed to independence, and now in Wales there have been several very large marches for independence. And today Adam Price announced that he has set up a commission to consider how an independent Wales could work. It will be chaired by Jocelyn Davies, a former minister in the Labour-Plaid coalition government in the Welsh Assembly. Explaining what the commission would do, Price said, "Something is happening in Wales. Over the past year, thousands have marched together in independence marches in Cardiff, Carnarvon and Merthyr. Polls show that around 30% consistently support independence. Independence has moved from the margins into the mainstream of Welsh political debate. Our mission is to convince the people of Wales that independence is not merely desirable, but actually vitally necessary to tackle our problems and improve our standard of living. That's why I'm proud to announce that Plaid Cymru have set up a commission chaired by the formidable Jocelyn Davies to look at how Wales can become independent in the next decade. The Arm's Length Commission will undertake extensive analysis and develop effective policy to carve a clear pathway to the independence we need as a nation." So, Ellen, this sounds a little bit like Wales are pursuing something like their own sustainable Economic Commission, something like some of the stuff that the SNP has been doing in government in the last few years. What do you make of this? 30% is quite a substantial number. That's arguably higher than where the Scottish independence movement was when the referendum was first called for 2014. Do you think Welsh independence is in the offing?
I mean, everybody starts small and it has to start somewhere. I think that the numbers are impressive. Up until a couple of years ago, the approval ratings for independence were in the low single digits, and we're now way, way beyond that. I think that's beautiful. I think if you look at the landscape, the media landscape, and we see that the reporting on Welsh independence is a rather different one than the one on Scottish independence, and it amuses me slightly, but it's something to listen out for. It is a much more gentle and inquisitive tone that is being taken in reports about Welsh independence, and a much more egregious and sort of closed fronts kind of approach to the Scottish independence reporting. So even though they are on the same journey as Scotland has been for a long, long time, they don't yet suffer from the same sort of the separatist rhetoric. And that's quite interesting. I think we're going somewhere. I'm not sure if Wales is ready, but is any country ever ready? It very much depends on the policies put forward or the vision that can be painted and the small actions that can be taken to show that the powers used in a devolved government are used well and constructively to further the interests of the people living within that area. And if the Welsh government is able to do this well, they might well be able to turn it around for Wales.
And on this idea of having a commission, we had, of course, the Sustainable Growth Commission in Scotland, which was not warmly received in all quarters, let's say. So what do you think? I mean, are these kind of commissions where they try to set out some sort of grand vision for independence? Do you think that's a useful tactic? Do you think that's necessary? Or do you think that maybe the way we were in 2014, where there was more of a sense of this is independence and make of it whatever you want to make of it? Do you think, which approach do you think is more successful, let's say?
I think that remains to be seen. I'm always, as a service and product designer, I'm always for consulting and understanding where the nation's kind of feelers lie at a certain point in time and about a certain issue. But the Growth Commission was shelved. The SNP in September announced that a new white paper was on its way, and that followed a Growth Commission that had to be discussed very fervently, not only from parties and stakeholders supporting unionists sort of thinking and the union as a whole, but also from within the independence movement. And I think that's where the criticism was even stronger. What saved the day in terms of the Growth Commission was the ability of the movement and individual Scottish bodies and stakeholders to come up with better plans to inform the public. These papers are so dense that quite often a lot of detail is missed. Like, one of the details that is really relevant to me as an EU citizen was that the solidarity payment that was suggested within the Growth Commission was that a payment that was split into 3 parts. One of these parts, and this payment goes on indefinitely. There is no end time for the couple of billions that we're going to send south after independence, according to the SNP. But part of this funding was meant to be used to receive services that the UK is currently providing for Scotland. In the meanwhile, we are setting up our own organisations. So this would be something that affects the Home Office, for example. Would we, based on the performance of the Home Office currently, hire it to do work for us? And do we want to pay the UK government indefinitely? These sort of small details get buried very easily in a large amount of paper and more words that also require quite intricate knowledge. So the discussion is kind of vital. But just because the Growth Commission has been shelved, as far as we can see, doesn't mean that the new paper that will be published will not be equally as contentious as the last one. It really remains to be seen how the criticism and the constructive working by different groups to give constructive criticism is taken into and developed on top of. And that's where we are hoping to go with this, I hope.
Well, moving on now, as we said, we did have another story about data. A whistleblower who works in Project Nightingale, the secret transfer of the personal medical data of up to 50 million Americans from one of the largest healthcare providers in the US to Google, has expressed anger that patients are being kept in the dark about the massive deal. The anonymous whistleblower has posted a video on the social media platform Dailymotion that contains a document dump of hundreds of images of confidential files relating to Project Nightingale. The secret scheme that was first reported by the Wall Street Journal involves the transfer to Google of healthcare data held by Ascension, the second largest healthcare provider in the US. The data is being transferred with full personal details, including names and medical histories, and can be accessed by Google staff. Unlike other similar efforts, it has not been made anonymous through a process of removing personal information known as de-identification. The whistleblower introduces the video with the words, "I must speak out about the things that are going on behind the scenes." They later gave some further comments to The Guardian. The disclosed documents include highly confidential outlines of Project Nightingale, laying out the 4 stages or pillars of the secret project. By the time the transfer is completed next March, it will have passed the personal data of 50 million or more patients in 21 states to Google, with 10 million or so files already having moved across, with no warning having been given to patients or doctors. And this is one of the kinds of stories that are just becoming more and more common across the world, Ellen. This kind of personal data being bought, sold, moved, transferred in potentially insecure ways without even the patients being notified, let alone asked their permission or given any sort of option to opt out. What do you make of this story?
It's nothing new. It's not even anything new in the UK. In the UK, it is possible to buy medical records. Even though they have been anonymized, you can search by very specific search factors that may make it possible for you to find somebody of whom you know a couple of conditions. This is true for NHS England. There's more data breaches of the sort. I think we've started to see a trend where the public perception used to be that individuals, shady individuals would grab your data offline and then, try to plunder your bank account. We're going to a whole different order of volume of data consumed and distributed in a way that does not agree with privacy right of any sort of understanding. I think we do need to catch up with what is happening there, though. It's very difficult, though, to change a system where the issues are perpetrated from within. In the UK, the Home Office has a special exemption about giving access to the information that they've used to make immigration decisions on. So no matter what your decision is, you will never know what the information was that they used to do this.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, this is something that is not new. Last July, DeepMind, which is the Google's AI division, was part of a data misuse scandal after the Royal Free Hospital transferred private patient data to DeepMind without informing patients. And that was apparently in order to test a new app that the company is working on. And this idea that company data can be used, private data can be used to test a private app. The company is making a profit from that. It's a profit-driven company, and yet this data was being given away apparently for free. Meanwhile, 6 NHS trusts in England have been given shares in another medical data company in exchange for access to anonymised patient data. Of course, if and when we leave the EU, it potentially means leaving the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, and potentially also opening up the NHS to private interests from the US and elsewhere. This is one of the things that anti-Brexit campaigners have talked a great deal about. I mean, how worried do you think we should be about the security of our data and the monetization of it?
I mean, quite frankly, I think we should all be worried. I'm pretty sure that almost all of us now watching this program are not secured from that sort of invasion, partially because we don't know where the threat comes from. Does it come through our phone? Does it come through going to the doctors, through using services? Is it something that, I have accidentally revealed about myself online? This data collection thing that we're afraid of, and the way that it's being traded, we're not even sure where the information has come from as laymen. And so we need to be really worried about it. There's a couple of good pieces of advice in the book that Edward Snowden has just released on how we should handle our private data. And that is worthwhile checking out and doing. Also a fantastic book, quite frankly. But it's almost impossible to shield yourself from a threat that you can't see and you don't know where it comes from and in what form it is going to arrive on your doorstep.
Yeah, and I mean, increasingly, just to operate in the modern world, it becomes impossible not to leave some sort of digital footprint. There's one of the Democratic candidates, Andrew Yang, has proposed an idea where when your data is monetized in whatever way, whether that's be from targeted ads all the way up to this kind of selling of medical data for research, that you would have to be informed and you would have to be compensated, that you would have to get a cut of the profits. Do you think a solution like that might be a way for us to start thinking about our data in a different way?
I'm a big fan of Yang. He's a inspirational sort of politician with big ideas. I think that one is a bit tongue-in-cheek. The violation of privacy rights is not made up for by just having a financial cut in that. Obviously, that is it's not a solution, but it's a good way to draw attention to what this data harvesting thing is about for the mainstay of those that are producing the data at this point. Those using the data may have different motivation than money. And I think that's where we as political objects, as democratic units, can individually make a difference by electing parties that have good policies and the right intentions about this.
Sure. Okay. Well, moving on, in Spain, the Socialist Party have reached a preliminary agreement with the newer left Podemos party to form a coalition government following Sunday's election. The election, which is the country's fourth in the last 4 years, left Spain's parliament even more fragmented than the previous election in April, with the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party retaining its lead but further away from a majority. If the deal is confirmed, this would be Spain's first coalition government since the country's return to democracy in the late 1970s. However, the combination of the 120 seats obtained by the Socialists and the 35 of Unidas Podemos is not enough on its own to secure a majority in the 350-seat parliament. And we do have a short clip from our correspondent, Pilar Fernandez, that I think we can have a quick look at now.
This is a huge image. It's an amazing image. Remember that in April, Pedro Sánchez and Pablo Iglesias didn't get any agreement. Now, by surprise, when the Popular Party was about to offer a grand coalition to the Partido Socialista, this just appeared. And a joint press conference was conducted by Pedro Sánchez and Pablo Iglesias to announce a pre-agreement of a coalition government. Huge news with a lot of basis of progressive policies. Of course, the Catalan case to try to get agreements, negotiations and dialogue is a big step for the Spanish politics, especially with the rise of the fascist organization Vox. So it's going to be a bit difficult because they don't have the numbers for an absolute majority. But the Basque nationalists say that they will approve a movement of a coalition government. So it's quite possible that maybe not in the first turn, which they need an overall majority, but at the second vote they will get with simple majority an agreement and approval of the Spanish Congress. Big news in Spain.
And that was our Spanish correspondent, Pilar Fernandez. This, as I said, does not create an overall majority, although the El Diario newspaper has reported that the Ciudadanos, another small left group that was only formed for this election called Mas PES, and the Basque nationalist PNV have all given indications that they would support this government. All of the parties on the left of centre in Spain are very worried about the rise of Vox. This what Pilar described as essentially a fascist party, which is now the largest right-wing party in Spain. So all of these left-wing parties, including even the Basque nationalists and some of the Catalan nationalist parties, may be involved in trying to work together as a united Spanish front against Vox. And Ellen, what do you make of the situation in Spain? I mean, we talk about how many elections and votes we've had to have in the last few years, but that's now a fourth general election in 4 years, the second this year. And it's still an extremely divided country. What do you think about this new left coalition?
I think the left coalition is not a bad idea. Obviously, this is something like in Scotland or in any other place where you have to understand the manifestos of the individual parties and agree to some sort of compromise. Spain, I really feel for all people of Spain.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's an incredibly complicated situation and very, very volatile. This volatility is not there by accident. The violence that escalated in Spain and in Catalonia, and the sort of rhetoric around independence and nationalism, and the lack of discussion about the lack of democracy has escalated into violence. And I think that keeps the tension high and it's not easy to bridge that gap. You cannot put this back into the box. So at some point, the discussion about how to give a proper compromise and how to come to a conclusion is the only thing that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be a bit of a trend across Europe. We've seen it here ourselves with the creation of the Brexit Party and the Change UK group. There do seem to be a lot of realignments and kind of new parties emerging all over the place in Europe. And Spain, as you say, it's a fascinating situation to watch. It's perhaps a less fun thing, I think, for the Spanish people, and a lot less fun for the Catalan people. But we will, of course, keep an eye on that. Our correspondent, Pilar, is always keeps us up to date. So we will let you know once we hear more about how that coalition is coming together. Meanwhile, in Turkey, the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has issued a thinly veiled threat that Turkey could release jailed Islamic State fighters and send them to Europe, a day after the country began its controversial policy of deporting foreign jihadists in its custody. You should revise your stance towards Turkey, which at the moment holds so many ISIS members in prison and at the same time controls those in Syria, Erdogan told European countries in remarks to reporters in Ankara earlier today. These gates will open and these ISIS members who have started to be sent to you will continue to be sent. Then you can take care of your own problem. So, Ellen, this threat from Erdogan, I mean, he's clearly not the best friend we have in that part of the world, and now threatening to send home people who, in many cases now, have been made stateless. What do you think of this threat that he's making?
Well, Erdogan has understood that he might not be our best friend, but in the context of the situation, he's our only friend. That means really uncomfortable bedfellows who have watched Turkey and made sure that Turkey would not have its accession to the EU successful, but still trying to do deals on the backs of the lives of the people with it. And he holds the bigger, most important, winnable hand here. He holds the wealth and the well-being of an awful lot of people. It is also not to be dismissed that the pure strain that it takes to accommodate that many people, to make sure that there are, even the basic needs are met. Turkey was not a wealthy country to begin with. So the money that is flowing in now to support, or should be flowing in from the EU to support Turkey in providing all the services that it can for the refugees. We have to have a very close eye on where that's being spent. There are several allegations around that sort of money and where it's going. At the minute, Erdogan just holds the better cards. We have put Europe into that position because Europe hasn't provided a successful route for refugees and migrants to come into Europe to seek safety. And by that, we have condemned them into the hands of a man, which we all agree is on his best way to become a dictator. We have done that consciously. And I think with this, as Spain, as with many other issues, we have the right to hold the EU accountable and to hold the representatives of the EU accountable and to make suggestions and policy proposals on how that should be done better.
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Turkey, Syria, and now the effect it may have on Europe are going to be, I think, possibly one of the big stories of the next few years. So we will obviously keep up to date with that as it develops. But our next story, Ellen, is one I'm sure you have a lot to say about. The Scottish Parliament this afternoon held a debate on protecting the rights of EU citizens in Scotland. Figures released by the Home Office found just a quarter of EU citizens living in Scotland had applied to remain in the UK under the EU settlement scheme by the end of July. And in October, Brandon Lewis, a minister within the Home Office, warned the UK would deport EU citizens after Brexit if they do not apply for the right to remain in time. The Scottish Government has repeatedly urged EU citizens to stay in Scotland after Brexit and has called for their rights to be guaranteed, regardless of any other outcomes from negotiations with the EU. However, there has been a lack of specific action from both the UK and Scottish governments to meet the concerns of EU citizens' organisations. And as a leading advocate for EU citizens' rights in Scotland, Ellen, what did you make of the debate this afternoon?
It was an interesting debate. I very first off, I was quite interested to see that the debating chamber was essentially quite empty. That was an interesting insight. We've seen in that debate a lot of the same phrases coming up and up and up again. You're welcome, you're valued. And I believe the Scottish Government in its intention to make this message heard. Not a single SNP representative has stood up and not repeated the phrase, you're welcome and you're valued. On the other side of the aisle, there was a few Tories who took issue with the way that the Scottish Government and representatives of it, and specifically Ben McPherson, the immigration minister, used the phrase hostile environment, which ironically, the Scottish Tory thought that it should not be used and that it was sort of a demeaning term and that the current policies of the Home Office and the current government were in no way hostile, which is quite interesting because the term hostile environment was created under Theresa May intentionally in the Home Office. So there's nothing to complain about here. If anything, the Tories should be holding up their track record on immigration. They have promised to diminish immigration, and as it seems, 50% of the migrants that used to come to Scotland do not come to Scotland anymore. So it has been thoroughly effective. If that is the party that they want to be known for, fantastic. On the other hand, we have the Scottish Government who at any opportunity declares that it finds settled status a demeaning, an inhumane, humiliating process that, you know, is unacceptable and should be dropped. But still, the only thing that we're hearing from the Scottish Government is to try and get to receive advice for EU citizens, and that they've provided this advice through the Citizens Advice Bureau, where you can, you know, find information on how to apply for settled status. I'm still not quite clear how those two messages come together and fuse into one coherent message, because either we disagree with settled status, in which case we shouldn't be sending people into that funnel, or we just do the best that we can and just send them down that way, but then have to stop complaining, because either we want them to apply or we don't.
And also today, the 3 Million, which is one of the major pro-EU citizens organisations throughout the UK, has been encouraging election candidates to promise the automatic preservation of all EU citizens' current rights. Do you think that's a good tactic, and do you think it can work?
I'm quite shocked by that, actually. The Free Million has been a fantastic organisation to defend and fight for EU citizens' rights since Brexit, the Brexit referendum took place. But occasionally, even an organisation like that, I feel, makes wrong choices, and this is one of them. No single candidate can commit to changing the laws in that way, and no candidate can make that promise individually for an entire party unless such a promise has been made, through conferences and the various democratic bodies within their parties. So to have people sign up to this pledge is very much dependent on the specific wording. And I think the one that I saw today was one that shocked me, if I'm quite honest. It basically said that the specific candidate guaranteed all rights for EU citizens. It is not possible to do that without massive policy and democratic backup from your party. So I find it really difficult to just take that.
And of course, we heard the other day that the Tories have been specifically advised not to sign up to any pledges about anything. I suppose we can probably expect the Lib Dems to sign anything that somebody puts in front of them, but that doesn't mean very much. It is an interesting choice of tactic. I suppose at least it does keep EU citizens' rights in the debate, though, which is something that I guess you would welcome.
I would much rather, instead of keeping us in the debate, which seems to have become a fairly popular pastime, you're welcome, you're valued. We appreciate the warm words, but it's time for action. It's been 3.5 years of warm words. There are several policy suggestions on the table, not least of which is one that the Scottish Government apparently had to announce 3 times, which was the re-extension of the voting rights for EU nationals in Scotland after Brexit, which still hasn't passed through Parliament. So it's really about time that we get going with this. I don't think that welcome and valued will pull this cart much longer. And with the immigration rate down by 50%, we really can't afford inaction for much longer either.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously one of your specialist subjects. It's something I'd love to talk to you more about, but I do have to let you know we are running out of time here. So we will move on now. A statutory public inquiry will be held to examine the circumstances leading up to and following the death of Sheku Bayo, Justice Secretary Humza Yousaf announced today. In a statement to Parliament, Mr Yousaf said the process of appointing the chair of the inquiry will begin shortly. Mr Yousaf will update Parliament early next year, confirming the inquiry's terms of reference. He said, "The First Minister and I met with Mr Bayo's family today to express our deepest condolences and assure them of our commitment to establishing the facts surrounding this tragic incident. They are right to expect a full public examination of the circumstances of Mr Bayo's death, and I stated my determination to put in place a process to deliver that. Today I can confirm that I will establish a statutory public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into the circumstances leading up to and following Mr Bayo's death." So, Ellen, this, of course, is the case of Sheku Bayo, who died in police custody some years ago now. His family have constantly said they felt that the police needed to be held responsible, and we heard this week that no charges would be brought against any of the police involved. So what do you make of this, just quickly? Would you welcome this kind of inquiry, or do you think it'll just lead to the same whitewash outcome that people have criticised so far?
I think it's important to have these inquiries, but maybe a bit earlier than 4.5 years later. Quite correctly, during that debate, it was pointed out that a question about the motivation behind the treatment of Sheku Bayo should be conducted during that investigation, and it should be looked at whether this had anything at all to do with racial profiling. These are questions that are uncomfortable, but they need to be asked and need to be answered nonetheless. Otherwise, we cannot help push in the right direction against discrimination and against hostility.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that this inquiry will be able to do is to look at all the circumstances surrounding it, not necessarily just the specific events leading up to his death, which is the kind of narrow focus of a fatal accident inquiry. So we will obviously keep an eye on that. Sometime early next year, Humza Yousaf has said we'll hear about the specific terms of reference for the inquiry. And our final story tonight, recommendations to improve support for care leavers at risk of homelessness have been welcomed by Housing Minister Kevin Stewart. A working group coordinated by the Away Home Scotland Coalition has produced 8 recommendations to make support for care leavers simpler and more consistent across Scotland. That report recommends that existing legislation is better implemented for those with a legal duty of care to care leavers to help prevent them experiencing homelessness, that care leavers who experience homelessness are rapidly provided with support which is tailored to their specific needs and circumstances, and that young people are prepared for and supported with care and sensitivity through the transition into adulthood. These seem, Ellen, like fairly obvious ideas that care leavers may be who are clearly at specific risk of homelessness should be given some more tailored and specific support. So, I mean, is this welcome? Is this too little, too late? What do you make of this story?
I mean, it's any support for those leaving care is important. Again, in my area of EU citizens, those that are in care and will hit the adulthood after Brexit, will have significant issues with settled status. There are just issues left, right and centre for those having been in the care of the state for a long time, and we need to be very careful and very considerate of those that are coming and joining society on much more unsteady ground than most of us are used to.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of issues that face people leaving care. I mean, poverty, homelessness, addictions, abuse, all kinds of things are more likely to affect people who are leaving the care system because they just don't have the support networks that most of the rest of us have. I guess in some senses, as you say, as somebody who moved across countries, across a continent, very young, you were in some similar situations yourself.
I was very young. I was still a teenager when I came to the UK. I was extremely vulnerable, and I made it through not because of any fantastic services, but because I got lucky. But I was very young and very exposed, quite cut off from my family and friends, and I wouldn't even have known to whom I should have turned. So in that regard, I guess I would have been, back then, one of those EU citizens that today nobody would want.
We did get there is a quote here from Kate Paulson from the Rock Trust, which assists young people to avoid, survive and move on from homelessness, who said Scotland has a history of progressive policy and legislation in relation to housing, homelessness and our care system. The Rock Trust thanks all of the partners who joined us in the Away Home Coalition to write the report and to drive forward our work to end youth homelessness in Scotland. That is something that, as you said earlier, child homelessness in Scotland is at a lower level than in England, although it could still be significantly better. But Scotland does generally do somewhat better at a lot of these critical social issues than we see elsewhere in the UK. What do you think that lies behind that? Is it just that the SNP are a better party of government, or is there something about the way the Scottish system is that you think helps Scotland to do better?
I believe that there's a difference in how the systems are connected in Scotland and the rest of the UK, so that files from different departments can be shared. So that often helps with going into specific cases and understanding the people behind the case number and their experience and their needs. But obviously any child homelessness is disastrous, and the way that we are currently trying to get through life as a dependent nation makes it almost impossible to mitigate all the effects of the austerity that are imposed upon Scotland by the current government.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ellen, it has been a fascinating hour and a little bit. We've actually gone slightly over time, but I hope that hasn't been too much of a problem for you. It has been fascinating talking to you. To those of you at home, thank you for joining us. We would remind you, as always, But making TV programs is a very expensive business. If you are able to support us at all, your £5 a month would make a huge difference. You can sign up as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter at broadcastingscotland.scot/register. As I say, your £5 a month makes us able to do more coverage, better coverage of all kinds of events. We have a number of events lined up during the election campaign. We will be doing election night coverage, and all of these things are going to take resources. So if you're able to support us, please do it now. Don't wait. Do it now. And that way we're going to be ready to give you the best possible coverage of the election as it comes on. So once again, thank you very much to Ellen for joining us. Thank you to you at home for joining us. And we will be back tomorrow night at the same time, Scotland at 7. I've been Kenny McBride. Good night.